Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. October 1970 marked one of the darkest and most dramatic chapters in Canadian history. Against the backdrop of a bustling Montreal, a radical separatist group known as the FLQ, the Front de Libération du Québec, unleashed a wave of terror that shocked the nation. It began with two high-profile kidnappings, British diplomat James Cross and Quebec's Labour Minister Pierre Laporte. As fear gripped the streets, the Canadian government responded with an extraordinary measure, invoking the War Measures Act, for the first time during peacetime. Soldiers patrolled neighborhoods, civil liberties were suspended, and arrests were made without warrants. For the first time, Canadians saw their own democracy teeter under the weight of internal conflict. But who were the FLQ and what did they want? How did a small group of extremists manage to push an entire country to the brink? This is the untold story of how a radical movement came dangerously close to destabilizing a nation. The FLQ, or Front de Libération du Québec, was a radical separatist group that emerged in the early 1960s during a period of deep social and political transformation in Quebec. Born out of frustration with what many French-speaking Quebecers saw as centuries of oppression by English-speaking elites, the FLQ blended Quebec nationalism with Marxist and anti-colonial ideology. They believed Quebec was not just a distinct culture, but a colonized nation that needed to be liberated, by revolution if necessary. Rejecting peaceful political movements, the FLQ embraced violence as a path to independence. Their early activities included a string of bombings targeting symbols of Canadian federalism and English dominance, mailboxes in wealthy neighborhoods, military recruitment offices, and even the Montreal Stock Exchange. These attacks were often accompanied by fiery manifestos calling for the overthrow of capitalism, the end of English influence in Quebec, and the creation of a socialist state. The 1960s were a time of intense upheaval in Quebec. Known as the Quiet Revolution, this era brought rapid modernization, secularization, and growing demands for greater autonomy. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Many French-speaking Quebecers remained economically disadvantaged, and tensions between Anglophones and Francophones intensified. Mainstream separatist parties like the Parti Québécois were gaining support through democratic means, but the FLQ saw them as too slow, too compromised. They wanted action, now. By the end of the decade, the FLQ had carried out over 200 violent incidents. Though support for their methods was limited, their message found an audience among young, disillusioned Quebecers who felt alienated by the slow pace of change. It was this volatile mix of ideology, inequality, and anger that would explode in 1970, plunging Canada into a constitutional and political crisis. On October 5, 1970, the FLQ took their most audacious step yet. They kidnapped British diplomat James Cross from his Montreal home. Disguised as deliverymen, members of the group forced their way in at gunpoint, tied up Cross's family, and vanished into the city with their hostage. Within hours, the FLQ issued a list of demands that stunned the nation. The group called themselves the Liberation Cell and demanded the release of 23 FLQ members in prison, the broadcast of their political manifesto on national television, the publication of their demands in major newspapers, a $500,000 ransom, and a plane to take them to Cuba or Algeria. These demands were not just about freeing comrades. They were designed to publicly humiliate the Canadian state and legitimize the FLQ's revolutionary cause. The reaction from the government was swift but cautious. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa were faced with a dire dilemma: negotiate with terrorists and risk setting a precedent, or stand firm and endanger the life of a foreign diplomat. At first, authorities tried to buy time, pretending to consider the demands while launching an intensive search operation. Meanwhile, the public watched in disbelief. The media exploded with coverage. Newspapers printed the FLQ's communiques, and TV stations broadcast dramatic updates, including a reading of the FLQ's manifesto. The tone was angry, defiant, and militant, attacking capitalism, colonialism, and the federal government. Fear spread rapidly. Citizens wondered who might be next. Was this just the beginning of a wider rebellion? Would violence escalate further? Montreal, once the cosmopolitan heart of Canada, was now gripped by uncertainty. For the FLQ, the plan was working. They had captured the country's attention, and they weren't done yet. Just 5 days after the abduction of James Cross, the crisis deepened. On October 10, 1970, the FLQ struck again, this time targeting one of Quebec's most prominent political figures. Pierre Laporte, the province's Minister of Labour and a close ally of Premier Robert Bourassa, was kidnapped outside his home while playing football with his nephew. The perpetrators were members of the FLQ's Chenier Cell, a more militant offshoot of the group. While the Liberation Cell still held James Cross, the Chenier Cell now had Laporte, and their intent was far more dangerous. The two cells operated independently but were united by a common ideology. The Liberation Cell seemed focused on political leverage, making demands, drawing attention, pressuring the government. The Chenier Cell, however, appeared less interested in negotiation and more committed to revolutionary action. Their kidnapping of Laporte wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. Laporte represented the very system the FLQ despised, a francophone who had risen through the ranks of the Canadian political structure, working within the establishment instead of trying to overthrow it. As news of the second kidnapping broke, panic turned into full-blown national crisis. Political pressure on Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau intensified. The public demanded action. Newspapers screamed headlines of terror and paralysis. Within days, Trudeau gave a now famous interview in which a reporter challenged the government's growing use of military force. When asked how far he was willing to go, Trudeau delivered a line that would echo through Canadian history. Just watch me. On October 16th, under immense pressure, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, the first and only time it has been used during peacetime. This unprecedented move gave police and military sweeping powers, mass arrests without charges, warrantless searches, and the suspension of habeas corpus. Overnight, soldiers filled the streets of Montreal. Dozens of suspected FLQ sympathizers were detained. Civil liberties were shelved in the name of national security. Canada was no longer just responding to a crisis. It was now in a state of emergency. Just 5 days after the abduction of James Cross, the crisis deepened. On October 10, 1970, the FLQ struck again, this time targeting one of Quebec's most prominent political figures. Pierre Laporte, the province's Minister of Labour and a close ally of Premier Robert Bourassa, was kidnapped outside his home while playing football with his nephew. The perpetrators were members of the FLQ's Chenier Cell, a more militant offshoot of the group. While the Liberation Cell still held James Cross, the Chenier Cell now had Laporte, and their intent was far more dangerous. The two cells operated independently but were united by a common ideology. The Liberation Cell seemed focused on political leverage, making demands, drawing attention, pressuring the government. The Chenier Cell, however, appeared less interested in negotiation and more committed to revolutionary action. Their kidnapping of Laporte wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. Laporte represented the very system the FLQ despised, a francophone who had risen through the ranks of the Canadian political structure, working within the establishment instead of trying to overthrow it. As news of the second kidnapping broke, panic turned into full-blown national crisis. Political pressure on Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau intensified. The public demanded action. Newspapers screamed headlines of terror and paralysis. Within days, Trudeau gave a now famous interview in which a reporter challenged the government's growing use of military force. When asked how far he was willing to go, Trudeau delivered a line that would echo through Canadian history. Just watch me. On October 16th, under immense pressure, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, the first and only time it has been used during peacetime. This unprecedented move gave police and military sweeping powers, mass arrests without charges, warrantless searches, and the suspension of habeas corpus. Overnight, soldiers filled the streets of Montreal. Dozens of suspected FLQ sympathizers were detained. Civil liberties were shelved in the name of national security. Canada was no longer just responding to a crisis. It was now in a state of emergency. With the crisis spiraling and the lives of two hostages hanging in the balance, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau faced intense scrutiny. In a now iconic television interview outside Parliament, a reporter challenged Trudeau about the increasing presence of soldiers on Canadian streets. The journalist pressed, asking how far he was willing to go in limiting civil liberties. Trudeau didn't hesitate. He responded bluntly, Well, there are a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is, go on and bleed. It's more important to keep law and order in society than to be worried about weak-kneed people. Just watch me. The very next day, on October 16th, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act. This gave the federal government sweeping powers rarely seen outside of wartime. Civil liberties were effectively suspended. Anyone suspected of supporting the FLQ could be arrested and held without charges. Police no longer needed warrants for searches. The army was deployed across Montreal in force, patrolling streets, guarding government buildings, and conducting raids. Over the following days, nearly 500 people were arrested, including artists, intellectuals, union leaders, and political activists. Most had no proven ties to the FLQ but were swept up in the crackdown due to their associations or past political statements. Homes were searched, offices raided, and fear lingered as friends and neighbors disappeared into custody with little explanation. Montreal, a city once celebrated for its openness and cultural vibrancy, now felt like an occupied zone. Tanks rolled through neighborhoods. Soldiers stood guard at intersections. Families whispered their worries, unsure of who might be arrested next. Public opinion was divided. Many Canadians, especially outside Quebec, supported the government's tough stance. They saw the FLQ as a terrorist threat that had to be crushed before it spread further. But in Quebec, especially among younger francophones, unease grew. Critics argued the War Measures Act was a blunt instrument, an overreach that punished the innocent and trampled on civil rights. The debate over Trudeau's decision would continue long after the crisis ended. Was it a necessary act of leadership in a time of danger, or an authoritarian response that revealed the fragility of Canadian democracy under pressure? On October 17, 1970, the crisis took a devastating turn. A message from the FLQ's Chenier cell led authorities to the trunk of a car abandoned near Montreal's Saint-Hubert Airport. Inside was the lifeless body of Pierre Laporte. He had been strangled with the chain from a religious medallion he wore, a deeply symbolic and chilling detail. Canada was stunned. What began as a political standoff had now become a murder investigation. The assassination of a sitting cabinet minister was unprecedented in Canadian history. The nation entered a period of collective mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Tributes poured in from across the country. Laporte had been a father, a journalist, and a public servant, someone who believed in reform from within the system. His violent death shattered any remaining notion that the FLQ could be reasoned with. The Chenier cell released a statement justifying their actions, calling Laporte a traitor to the Quebecois people. They claimed he represented the oppressive state they were fighting against. But their words only deepened the outrage. Public sympathy for the FLQ, limited even before the murder, collapsed almost entirely. Many who had once quietly supported the separatist cause now recoiled in horror at what had been done in its name. For the government, Laporte's murder marked a critical turning point. The crisis was no longer just about hostage negotiations or ideological debates. It was now about justice, order, and preventing further bloodshed. The full force of the state was brought down on the FLQ. The War Measures Act remained in place, and military operations intensified. This tragic moment unified much of the country in its resolve. What the FLQ had hoped would ignite revolution instead drew a line in the sand. Their movement, once loud and defiant, was now losing ground rapidly. The death of Pierre Laporte didn't advance their cause. It isolated them and accelerated their downfall. In the weeks following Pierre Laporte's murder, the Canadian government intensified efforts to end the crisis peacefully, especially in the case of James Cross, who was still being held hostage by the FLQ's liberation cell. Behind the scenes, tense negotiations continued. The goal was clear: bring Cross home alive, without further bloodshed. After nearly 2 months in captivity, a breakthrough came. On December 3, 1970, an agreement was reached. In exchange for James Cross's release, the government offered the kidnappers safe passage to Cuba, an arrangement made possible through diplomatic channels with Fidel Castro's regime, which had previously harbored political radicals. Under heavy security, the 5 FLQ members and their families were flown to Havana. James Cross, though visibly shaken and physically weakened, was freed unharmed. With Cross safe and the Liberation Cell out of the country, attention turned to the Chenier Cell, the group responsible for Pierre Laporte's death. They had gone into hiding, but were eventually tracked down. On December 28th, police arrested Paul Rose, Jacques Rose, and Francis Simard, 3 key members of the cell. All were charged and eventually convicted in connection with Laporte's kidnapping and murder. Paul Rose and Simard received life sentences. By early 1971, the October Crisis had come to an end. The War Measures Act was lifted, and the soldiers withdrew from Montreal. The FLQ, now fractured and discredited, never regained its former momentum. Over time, the remaining members were either arrested or faded from public life. Though the violence had ended, the legacy of the crisis remained. It sparked years of national debate over civil liberties, state power, and Quebec's place in Canada. It also reshaped the separatist movement itself, pushing it away from violent extremism and toward democratic channels like the Parti Québécois, which would eventually form a provincial government. The October Crisis was more than just a political emergency. It was a moment when the nation faced the limits of its tolerance, the strength of its institutions, and the painful cost of division. Canada emerged from it forever changed, more wary, more unified, and more aware of how fragile peace can be. The October Crisis left a deep and lasting impact on Quebec and all of Canada, shaping political and social landscapes for decades to come. For the Quebec independence movement, the violent tactics of the FLQ became a cautionary tale. While the desire for greater autonomy and cultural recognition remained strong, most Quebecers turned away from armed struggle, embracing peaceful and democratic means instead. This shift paved the way for the rise of the Parti Québécois, which sought sovereignty through referendums and political negotiation rather than violence. At the same time, the government's heavy-handed response sparked fierce criticism and ongoing controversy. The invocation of the War Measures Act suspended fundamental civil liberties, leading to hundreds of arrests without charges and widespread fear. Many argued that this was an excessive use of state power, a dangerous precedent that threatened the democratic rights Canadians held dear. Activists, intellectuals, and legal experts questioned whether the crisis truly warranted such extreme measures, and whether Trudeau's government had crossed a line in prioritizing security over freedom. These debates over civil liberties versus national security continue to resonate in Canada today. The balance between protecting citizens and preserving democratic rights remains a delicate one that was profoundly tested during the October Crisis. The event forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable questions about the limits of government authority in times of crisis. Ultimately, the FLQ crisis shaped modern Canada by highlighting the fragile nature of unity in a diverse country. It exposed deep cultural and political divisions, but also strengthened institutions and sparked reforms aimed at addressing Quebec's grievances through dialogue rather than violence. The memory of October 1970 remains a powerful reminder of how democracy can be challenged and how a nation can strive to overcome its darkest moments. The FLQ crisis is a stark reminder of how fragile peace and democracy can be when faced with fear, division, and violence. It challenges us to think deeply about the balance between security and civil liberties, questions that remain as relevant today as they were over 50 years ago. What happens when governments are pushed to their limits? How do societies protect themselves without sacrificing the freedoms that define them? Reflecting on this turbulent chapter in Canadian history helps us understand the importance of dialogue, respect, and vigilance in preserving democracy. What do you think? Was Trudeau's decision to invoke the War Measures Act justified, or did it go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective. And don't forget to join us next week when we dig into another gripping Canadian political scandal that shook the nation to its core. Until then, thanks for watching.